This summer, the Starship Enterprise continues her mission to explore strange new worlds, seek out new life and new civilizations in Star Trek Into Darkness, the second film in J.J. Abrams' reboot of the classic series. I grew up on Star Trek. To me, this is one of the most important pop culture phenomena of the last 50 years. The show debuted in 1966, and the reverberations of what it accomplished are still felt today. I'm Devin Faraci, and this is Badass Digest. The show never should have taken off. Gene Roddenberry had this idea, and he sold it to the network as Wagon Train to the Stars, because Westerns were all the rage at the time. But Roddenberry was an idealist, and he had this vision of the future where mankind kind of got its together, where people came together as a united Earth to explore the stars, where the different planets in the galaxy came together as a united federation of planets, where war, disease, poverty, all these things had already been eradicated. That's, I think, part of what makes the show work and why people really care about the Star Trek universe, because in the end, it's a very positive vision of where we're going. This original pilot, called The Cage, was very different from what we know as Star Trek today. There was a different captain in charge of the Enterprise, Captain Christopher Pike. His number one was a woman. Spock was on the Enterprise as well, but a very different version of what we know as Spock today. He was much more emotional and almost childlike in a lot of ways. The network wasn't quite taken with the show, but liked the concept, so they gave Roddenberry a second chance. This new pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, really set the stage for what Star Trek was going to become. In this pilot episode, the Enterprise is at the edge of the galaxy, goes farther than anyone's ever gone, and as a result hits a weird energy field. Captain Kirk's best friend, Gary Mitchell, finds that he is now imbued with the powers of a god. And this is what, this is the pilot. This is the first episode. It isn't what the first episode aired, but it is the first episode that they made with this new crew. And so Roddenberry pushed it right to the edge. The idea of not just saying, what if we're in space and we meet aliens? What if we're in space and we meet the ultimate versions of ourselves? Gary Mitchell becomes a god and his humanity corrupts him. Captain Kirk has to take down his best friend. This is big, heady stuff. This is stuff that, 2001 would later on really make much more mainstream. But at the time, Roddenberry was taking crazy pulp science fiction ideas and putting them right out there onto primetime television. In the second season, ratings were down, and rumors began to swirl that the show was getting canceled. The fans of Star Trek created a groundswell on their own, sending thousands of letters to NBC demanding the show be renewed. Trek came back for a third season, but things were changed up. Roddenberry found himself sidelined, and at the end of season 3 was the final episode of Star Trek. But the show didn't die. This fan base that had risen up in season 2 began to find each other, and Star Trek began to have conventions. Meanwhile, the show hit syndication. The fan base grew. Then, something happened in 1977, and what that was Star Wars. And all of a sudden, space stuff was hot all over again. So Paramount decided to resurrect Star Trek, and they decided to make Star Trek the motion picture.
Star Trek, the motion picture.
If you talk to fans of Star Trek, they have a sort of a pet name for this movie. They call it Star Trek the Motionless Picture, and that's because it's pretty boring. And I say that as a huge I have a Star Trek tattoo, and it's a pretty boring movie. It didn't make as much money as maybe it should have. It cost a ton of money. And so Paramount was sort of not really sure what to do now. They decided to come back for a sequel, kind of cut the budget, go a little bit cheaper, see what happened. They brought in a guy named Nicholas Meyer. There was a character who had appeared in the original series who he thought had a lot of possibility as a big screen villain. That was Khan. Khan is probably the name most associated with Star Trek outside of Kirk and Spock. That's because of Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, one of the greatest space action movies of all time. Star Trek II was an enormous hit. Ricardo Maltoban's Khan is an iconic character in cinema history. Nick Meyer really figured out that relationship between Kirk and Spock and made it really sing on screen. And all of a sudden, this movie, which didn't cost that much, was just an enormous success. So, more had to come. They had a small problem. Leonard Nimoy had made a demand. He said, in Star Trek II, I gotta die. And they said, sure. And it's a great moment. I'm not spoilers, but the movie's 31 years old. And it's one of the defining moments of Star Trek as a franchise. But it was such a big success that they had to come back and they had to bring Spock back. So they brought back Leonard Nimoy. One of the carrots they dangled in front of him was he got to direct the next movie, Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. It's not, not the best, but it's pretty good.
Warp speed.
Star Trek III was a pretty big hit as well, and so all of a sudden what you have now is this is now a series that's ongoing, and Star Trek has a second wind. It's amazing. Everybody had written it off, and here it is. It's a mainstream blockbuster series. Star Trek IV, they changed it up in a pretty great way, time traveling to San Francisco of the then present and making it much more comedic. Leonard Nimoy also directed that one. Here's a really interesting little bit of trivia. Eddie Murphy was a huge Star Trek fan. and he had wanted to be in a Trek movie. And Star Trek IV had originally been set to star him. The whole thing fell apart, and we got the movie that we got. After IV, I think the series sort of peaked. Star Trek V came. William Shatner, who had never been humble, decided that he really wanted to get on the directing action as well. So he directs Star Trek V, and I've tried again and again and again to give Star Trek V a good chance, but the movie's a piece of shit. I hate to say it.
I know this shit like the back of my hand.
There was one more, Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Nick Meyer returned, sort of wrapped everything up. It was really sweet. And then that was more or less the end of the original Star Trek. In 2009, Paramount decided to come back to Star Trek. And, Star Trek had become very convoluted, had become very fan-oriented over the previous decades. The Next Generation, DS9, Voyager, Enterprise, all of these things really were appealing to a more and more limited audience that honestly didn't include even me. So Paramount decided it was time to go back to the original series, but what do? All these people are either dead or old, right? So they brought in J.J. Abrams, and J.J. Abrams is not necessarily a Star Trek guy, he's a Star Wars guy, and that's why he's directing Star Wars 7. But he did, to his credit, really infuse the kind of excitement and adventure that you felt watching these old Star Trek episodes when you were a kid. And so Star Trek, is now back. Star Trek Into Darkness is opening. The villain, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, known to us as Sherlock from BBC series, is he Khan? There's been a lot of back and forth about it. Yes, he's Khan. It's interesting to see them sort of retreading some of this ground. Where does it go next? Star Trek is back in the popular consciousness in a way that it has not been, I would say, since 1983. It's an exciting moment to be a Star Trek fan. It's an exciting opportunity to sort of see Roddenberry's ideals hopefully be brought back to the screen. The idea that humanity is going to get it together. The idea that people can work together. The idea that our differences are what actually make us stronger. These are kind of like silly, corny ideas, but they're great ideas. And they're the things that really always powered the Star Trek franchise throughout the decades. I feel like I haven't really gotten across to you guys why I like Star Trek so much that I've branded myself with a Star Trek tattoo. So I want to come back again next week and keep talking about Star Trek, if you'll have me. And we're going to talk about what it is that makes it work, and these characters in this universe, and why people have cared so much for the last 40 years. I'm Devin Faraci, and this is Badass Digest.
Get your film fix. Subscribe to CineFix.